Greetings and welcome to the Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. I'm Phyllis Hollis, your host. As an extension of my Instagram page, Cerebral Women, this podcast offers insights into the visual art world. I interview artists, mainly artists of color and female artists who will freely articulate what inspires their creativity. In addition, you'll hear interesting perspectives from dedicated art professionals who work with artists and the art institutions that feature them. I'm confident that collectively, these individuals will indeed stimulate your mind as they do our eyes. Please know these interviews are conducted in my Manhattan apartment, so please forgive the background sounds of city life. Welcome to the Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. This episode features Ibrahim Mahama. He was born in Tamale, Ghana, and lives and works in Accra, Kumasi, and Tamale. His practice includes developing and expanding the contemporary art scene in his home country, encompassing an exhibition space, research facilities, and an artist residency hub. He exhibits nationally and internationally, including Germany, the Netherlands, France, Africa, Israel, as well as the United States. In 2024, his solo exhibitions included White Cube, New York, Fruitmarket Gallery in Edinburgh, Scotland, and Barbican Centre in London. Nationally, his exhibitions have included the High Line in New York in 2021, the University of Michigan Museum of Art in 2020, amongst others. He has participated in numerous group exhibitions, including Sharjah Biennial 15 in 2023, the 18th International Venice Architecture Biennale, as well as the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, Texas, the 22nd Biennale of Sydney, Australia, to only mention a very few. In 2022, Ibrahim was appointed Artistic Director of the 35th Ljubljana Biennale of Graphic Arts in Ljubljana, Slovenia. In 2024, Ibrahim was selected for the inaugural Sam Gilliam Award by the Dia Art Foundation and the Sam Gilliam Foundation, which includes the presentation of a public program at Dia in the fall of 2024. Enjoy this episode featuring Ibrahim Mahama, and please make sure to visit cerebralwomen.com to read his very impressive expanded bio. Thank you. Welcome to my podcast. I recently viewed your work. I'm so intrigued, so I'm really excited about our conversation today. We'll dive in. When did you discover your artistic passion, that you yearn to be a visual artist?
Thank you very much. I started studying art as a full program in high school, actually. Because, in Ghana, you can already study whatever, maybe you can already start studying very specific things when you're in high school that would lead to a career one day. So, for instance, if you want to become a doctor, maybe you can study science in high school. If you want to become a business person, you can study business in school, or home economics or agriculture. And I studied arts because at the time, I spent most of my childhood days in boarding school. And I had this love for art, creative things, drawing, making notes and sketches and all kinds of other things. And even when when the school would send us on an excursion and my parents would give me money to buy food or snack, I would use the money to buy, for instance, something that someone had done, like a craft, like some kind of a craft. I really always liked the things that people made with their hands, and I was very fascinated by it. So my parents naturally thought that maybe I had this kind of creative thing in me, and they said, why not study art in high school? Which I know is very unusual because most parents don't want their kids to study art, but I ended up in art school, and then there was a ripple effect that led to this very moment.
How do you define your practice?
My practice, there are different strands to it. So there's a part of my practice where I collect old objects and I produce exhibitions. And there is a part of my practice where I also build institutions with these objects, or I build institutions where it allows for communities to come together and all that. I've done many different exhibitions in different institutions across the last decade. But I've also, within that period, I've also built 3 different institutions in northern Ghana. One, which is an old abandoned silo, which I bought with proceeds from my work, and then brought it back to life so we could use it as a cultural space and a public space. And then one which is the first studio space I built, which is the Savannah Center for Contemporary Arts, where we host major retrospectives of artists, the idea of bringing artists' work back to life. And then we have the Red Clay, which is my studio, but which is the biggest of all of them. And we have cinemas, libraries, like archive rooms. We have like exhibition spaces with permanent collection. We have temporal spaces. We have like spaces for archaeological work. We have residencies. We have studios. And then it's also something that I'm building into like a much bigger, like independent art school in the future. And most importantly, we also have like remnants of old historical objects like the trains, some of the trains that were used in Ghana's history, together with the rail lines that were built in the late 1800s, together with old airplanes that we use as classrooms.
That's fascinating. So within your practice, can you say which aspect of it you enjoy the most?
I guess it's the freedom that it comes with, the thinking, because for me, art has always been about the expression of oneself, but also expression of oneself, which is somehow connected to the collective. Because through an artist's work, it allows us to be able to, for instance, come to certain realizations that normally we wouldn't have. Because the artist's mind is always at work and is always thinking about making the connections that ordinarily we're too busy to establish those connections. And I think it's within those connections that the point of freedom can be established. So for me, that's the most enjoyable part of being an artist, the idea that I can just wake up and think that, oh, I have this idea of connecting this and that, like the work at the White Cube, where the drawings, I said, oh, why don't we just bring the railway objects from the south to the north? And why don't we work with the young people there to carry these objects and then make studies and make drawings out of it? Or why don't we collect the old beds and why don't we use the internal parts of like the old German train carriages, the floor, and then make tattoos on them and then put them on the beds almost as if they were decayed bodies and all that. So these are the things that we think of. They don't make sense immediately, but the thing about art is that there's a poetry to it. And that poetry doesn't necessarily need to make sense within a moment. People can get different fragments out of it. And even you, the artist, when you produce the work, it's not as if you have the whole answer in your mind. You're producing a vision that comes to you. And in that vision, even you yourself can look at it another time and you can get a different meaning out of it. So it's not as if we are there to produce meanings. No, we are there to produce things that collectively all of us can re-engage with.
What materials do you use in your work?
In the beginning of my practice, I was collecting all these jute sacks that are primarily brought in from India and Bangladesh. So our government buys these jute sacks in massive quantity. And when they are brought to Ghana, they are used solely for the bagging of cocoa beans. Because Ghana, for the bigger part of the 20th century, was the largest producer of cocoa in the world. Currently, it's Ivory Coast, but there's also Indonesia and Brazil. And Nigeria, I don't know where Ghana is now. I think we're second or third. So when the bag is brought to Ghana and the beans are put into it, the beans are transported to the port and then they cut open the bags and then they put the beans into containers which are shipped to the companies abroad who produce chocolate. Ghana, we don't have chocolate producing factories. There's only one which we have, which is the Golden Tree, which is part of the cocoa processing company, which is connected to a much larger infrastructure project which was built in the 60s. Post-independence in Ghana, when Nkrumah, our first president, thought that Ghana being the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence, the idea was to build infrastructure that could lead us to true economic independence. That's processing our own food and commodities, like having like the trading power globally. But most of this didn't really work out. So it's almost as if like it came with this post-independent crisis. So the material that I work with, the jute sacks, all these histories are absorbed within it. So I'm more interested in it when there's no longer use for cocoa and then the market women will buy it and then they will use it to trade commodities and all these other things. To a point where when they put, for instance, charcoal in it, charcoal stains it beyond recognition. So you cannot use it for any other food. That's when it gets to ground zero. But for me, I think that's when it's even beginning to live, because at that point, the women are writing their names on it. There are parts that are cut. They sew it with parts of their clothes that are torn. So it almost becomes like a flesh. So I started working with these kinds of materials. So I then now started looking at the relationship between this and the bodies of buildings. So I would assemble a huge team of people together. We'll go to old railway factories, market spaces. We'll sew these materials together in the studio context-like spaces in those places. and then we will wrap these buildings. And then I also said, okay, fine, why don't we use like airplanes or trains? Because some of these objects, they are in a state of decay and then they might cut them into pieces. Why? So why not use them as sculptures? So why not collect archives from the factories which are going to be burnt? Because they have so many markings on them. So why not use the surfaces as a means for drawing? So I'm always interested in materials which are in a state of decay and materials which almost look as if they no longer belong in the world that we live in. But it's also because of the human centric thing, because human beings, we always think everything is about us. But materials actually collect memories, and they collect memories more than us. They've been here millions of years, billions of years before us. So I'm always very respectful about these materials, that even when we see them as things that are deliric or things that are out of order, that is when actually they've accumulated memory that we need to have a dialogue with those memories. So that is where the choice comes from.
You say, why not? I absolutely love that. You view it as anything is possible, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
While you're creating, all these thoughts are on your mind. Do you think about the audience? Do you think about how people will feel? Will they understand your work?
To be honest, sometimes you imagine that there's a likeness to it where people can connect with. And sometimes you also ask yourself, how are people going to connect? But I think that people always come to understanding things from their own point of view. Sometimes it's just about the aesthetics. Because we as artists, sometimes when we're making a work, it's from a visual point of view. Sometimes it's more from a philosophical point of view. And sometimes there is no point of view at all. It's just a feeling that you have and you just produce something, and then people or the audience would make up their own meanings out of it based on their relationship to these forms or not. So I guess I'm always curious about what the audience think about the work. Let's go back to the work at the White Cube now. Full of good things. And I collected these beds from the hospital in northern Ghana, in Tamale, where my studio is. And when I made the work and it was sent to New York, particularly, I thought that in America it would be quite interesting because of the healthcare crisis and all that. I have a brother who's a neurosurgeon and he trained in Cuba. And even Cuba is not so far away from America. It's just a few kilometers from Florida. But then when you look at the healthcare system in Cuba, even with the country that has been under embargo and then struggling, you realize that the discrepancies, they have even a much more structured healthcare system than there is in America, even with all the difficulties, the economic difficulties. So I was looking at that in relation even to like Tamale, where I live, or even Ghana itself, with regards to the healthcare crisis and everything. So certainly one might look at the work that is produced from, let's say, Ghana, Colombia, Argentina, that ends up in a different context. And people might be able to relate to it a lot more because it speaks much more to them within their own environment than maybe it would have the same power that it would have in Tamale. So I thought that, yeah, why not? Why not just take this idea and then present it within the context of America and see the relations that will be made out of it?
With your drawings, at what point do you decide the title?
To be honest with you, the titles are always done after the work is done. The title is always the last thing, even the title of an exhibition. It takes me so long. Sometimes the gallery has to harass me literally for the title because I'm like, I'm still thinking about it. I'm still thinking about it. And the titles of the exhibitions, I always would take a title of a book. I don't necessarily need to know the entire content of the book because I also think that in our work, sometimes when you pick a title, you're looking at, let's say, just the structure of, let's say, the material in relation to the work and the experiences that you had when you were making the work. So some of those would come from that, so from literature. And then some of them also come from songs. So for instance, I had a show in Germany not long ago, and the title of the show was Rubber Soul, but it was in relation to like the album of the Beatles, Rubber Soul. But the fact that also within the exhibition, I had a lot of like photographs which had all these tattoos on the arms of like women who've migrated from the rural area to the cosmopolitan in order to be able to do odd jobs and looking at the labor conditions and all that. And the fact that the soul is embedded within these markings and things like that. Yeah, so that's where the titles come from. The music aspects, in the case of the work currently at the White Cube, a lot of them are titled after the songs of a Ghanaian legend, Ejako Nimo. And for me, those were very important, particularly titling those because the timelines, he's a very old musician. And a lot of the songs that he's done also talks about like human relations, the relationship between us and like the world, like our soul. And I thought that I needed to establish a relationship between the people and like the objects, the trains and then the train lines and the histories. So I went into his history online and I looked at all the different albums that he had done over the years, and then I just distributed them across the different artworks based on like the form.
And are you listening to music while you're working?
Yes, I do. But in the studio, because I work with different collaborators who are like helping me with different things, because if I need to produce a work, for instance, I trained as a painter and a sculptor. So I make drawings and make things with my hand, like the works that I produce. But I also like the idea of working with people who you want to, for instance, produce like a silver object or bucket, and you know that there is someone that's his job. So you work with those people in order to even challenge them about what they think they already know. And through this collaboration, you're able to create something a lot more. And they look at it like, sometimes you go with them with a drawing, like, oh, I want to make this. Can you help me to produce this in a studio? And they're like, but we don't do it this way. And I'm like, well, but this is art. Yeah, we can do it this way. You know, like, yeah, but we can do it this way. I don't know. Don't worry. I always thought that this is not medicine, it's not surgery. No one is going to die because of this. Be free and just let's just create and see what comes out of it. So I like working with people in that capacity. So sometimes they want to listen to their own music. There is something that makes them feel a lot more alive than maybe what I will have. Maybe on a tip, sometimes I'm nostalgic and I want to listen to Coldplay, maybe a particular album that I listened to when I was in university. And then I wanted that to inspire me in the day. Like some people might not want to be listening to Coldplay in that moment. So I always allow everyone in the studio to listen to whatever they want to listen to that inspires them or not. Like even not that sometimes the studio is completely quiet as we work. So it depends.
How do you keep learning?
I surrounded myself with people that challenge me by constantly trying to produce things that I have no idea how they're going to go or end up. Because sometimes I start a project and then I'm like, what am I even doing? And then you leave it for like some months and you come back to it maybe a year later. And then you realize that whilst you left it and you were having dialogues and going through the world, you were learning other things that was going to come around and inspire the work. So it depends on what it is. But certainly, I always like to surround myself with people who can inspire me from all walks of life, all fields. They could be doctors, engineers, they could be scientists, they could be agriculturalists. So when I have an idea, I just talk to different people about it. And I also like to share. I like to share my ideas with people in forms of lectures and others. And people would ask you questions. Sometimes they ask you challenging questions that you didn't think about, even if you think you've thought about it for quite a while. So for me, all these are quite important learning tools, aside reading and also listening to people, like listening to videos online of interviews and like intellectuals talking about ideas. But just the idea of like the human relation, like just discussing things that you're thinking about with other people is also, for me, one of the best learning tools.
Do you feel Black art can be defined?
Well, it depends on the context where you find yourself. So, for instance, for us in Africa, or for instance, in Ghana, I would say we've always just made art. In the context of, for instance, if you find yourself in America or other places in Europe, then you know that there are different populations. Like there is like African American artists, there are like Chinese American artists. So sometimes in terms of like techniques and also histories of like economic systems and all that would also inspire artists to make certain types of works or produce with certain types of materials, which others wouldn't have. They would have made different choices and all that. But here, we always had the same mediums, because there are a lot of like artists in my generation, but I try as much as possible to push this as far as I can in a context where I would work with materials which no one would have ever thought about working with before, like just constantly trying to push the boundaries beyond. And sometimes you realize that, maybe the work that you're doing, artists, maybe like older American artists, like the context of, let's say, Robert Smithson or Richard Serra, or some of these artists, even artists like Anna Mendieta or others, would have done some of this work historically. But then in the context of us, we're trying to reinvent that conversation and that dialogue, because the population who came to inherit this work geographically wasn't the same as where you're coming from. So certainly, I like the idea that as a black artist coming from a certain part of the world, you can be able to make work that challenges the entire notion of what art has been historically and who art has been made for.
Early on, do you recall if there was a certain art professor that really had an impact on how you're going to build your practice?
Yeah, certainly. We have Professor Dr. Caricature from the University of Science and Technology. That's the Kwame Nkrumah University in Kumasi. That's where I studied. I had my undergrad there from 2006 to 2010, and I later went back to do my MFA in painting and sculpture in 2011 to 13. And then 15, I started my PhD, which I'm hoping to finish one of these days. Yeah, he was one of the, arguably, I always say that he's one of the single greatest character in our modern art history. There are a couple of other artists and thinkers who did quite a significant work. To name a few, Ella Natri certainly is one of the very important artists who also came from the same art school. And you have Glover, and then a couple of other artists who also trained within that context. But caricature was or is the character who became interested in the idea of widening up the artistic language or training within the art school. So for instance, even the idea of like using philosophy as a means of teaching, which wasn't very popular within the art school, he was the one that introduced that into the art school training, and the idea of collapsing the different disciplines. So for instance, courses, if you were a painting student or a sculpture student, you had printmaking, you had paper making, you had painting, you had like drawing. But you just look, this is art. Let's just put all together and let the artist decide what technique they want to use. So for instance, if a painter wants to use poetry or theater or chemistry to make it work, then he can go and then learn that. Like, it's the idea of the artist knowing that first and foremost, he's working with those ideas. Those ideas allow us to be able to, for instance, work with certain material forms around us, because ideas allow us to somehow excavate certain materialities which ordinarily we wouldn't have. So he was that character. So even when I said that, I think I might want to build a studio, he said to me, why not build a studio where you came from? It's a very difficult place. Historically, it has always been economically deprived and all that. And I said, but there's no art market there. There are no patrons, blah, blah, blah. And he said, yeah, but why not? I'm not making art because of all that. You're making art because the idea of art is to push the boundaries of freedom. So if you do it in this place with all these precarities, it will go a long way to even influence another generation of thinkers, generation of artists, or practitioners who might do other things. Imagine you have engineers or doctors who are practicing with artistic sensibility. Don't you think that will be much better for the world in the future? That was a very big influence on me. So I thought, okay, why not go to this place and then see what becomes? And that was 10 years ago. And imagine within a decade, so much happened within the last decade.
Your life sounds exciting, but I still have to ask you this question. What are you excited about right now?
That's an exciting but difficult question also. In Ghana, most of the projects that I've been working on has been very communal based. And in the studio, the idea has basically, for me, the question about art has always been about a question of redistribution. How do we redistribute ideas and forms? It has always been very, very important to me. We've been running these programs where we send buses to like communities far away in villages, and then we bring the school kids from those communities to see the contemporary collections and exhibitions that we have within our institutions. Or if we even go there and we screen films, we take books, we do reading sessions and all kinds of other things. So currently I'm trying to push that a lot further. That is one of the most exciting things for me now, seeing the fact that a lot of young people are really beginning to believe a lot in art, or to see like the existence of art, particularly contemporary art. Because when I see it most often in the Western context, it almost always feels as if that institutions in the West are made for specific audience. Because even in America, when you're going around these museums, you don't see the kids from the Bronx or the kids from like all these other deprived areas going to the museums. When you go to Philadelphia or even in Baltimore, and you see all these difficult, like economic difficulties in all these most rundown neighborhoods and community, you always ask yourself, how many of the parents in these areas who are even struggling to put food on the table would send their children to see all these wonderful works of art? So I always feel like the responsibility of the institution is not just the idea of existing, it's the idea of stretching itself, extending its boundaries. So sometimes the extending the boundaries of an institution is just one bus away and one program at a time, where you're going to communities and you're running programs, you're providing food, you're like inviting artists to establish relationships with these people so they can trust that the idea that there is a big, massive infrastructure in the middle of the city where you can go and see a Pollock is worth it. And there is something a lot more than seeing a Pollock than just paint on the canvas. So for me, I think that from currently, that's one of the most exciting things, getting to this point of realization and then trying to push it a lot further.
This is our last question. I've enjoyed our conversation very much. It's very enlightening. What do you feel is the purpose of art, and what do you feel is your role?
Well, in all human endeavors and history, we've always tried to understand what art has been, whether it is just there for recording time and history or events, or whether it has been there as some kind of a seed that can somehow sow like different possibilities in the future. Art is more or less supposed to be like the space which there are limitless potentials, limitless ways of seeing the world, limitless ways of experiencing the world and all that. So the starting point of art has always been freedom. It has no end point, but the continuous fact is that it's supposed to open up endless points of freedom and multiple points of freedom in ways in which we can experience the world beyond our imagining. So that is one. And two, the role of the artist is basically to create these points. So the role of the artist is not to say this is not possible. The role of the artist is this might be difficult, but how do we make it possible? How do we build this? How do we make work? So for me, the role of the artist has never really been to make just objects. The role of the artist has always been to open up different points of gifts, because life in itself is a gift to begin with. So the question is that sometimes we have more gifts than other people. And also the suffering or the precarity of the world is a gift in the inspiration that it gives us. So we're to produce our work. So when you produce a beautiful painting or a sculpture that is motivated by the difficulty within your community, the question is that when the Midas touch, the golden hand of art, the art world, or the point about art in itself, when it touches that work and it changes the value of that object, how does that come back to the community to change the narrative or to create a different context in which different people can relate to it? So if you come to my studio, for instance, we have permanent collections of works some of which have been sold to museums around the world. But historically, these works would have never been in Ghana. All of them would have been in New York. And for instance, kids in Ghana would have needed to grow up to one day travel to New York to see it. But by the time they would have seen it, people would have already experienced their future and they would have been living in the past. So the question is that by using the proceeds of those to create these institutions, for instance, in rural areas and all that, and these kids experiencing these works in real time, certainly it opens up a different world in terms of how we're communicating with the rest of the world. I think I spoke to someone today about that we're in 2024. And in this century of technological advancement, where almost everyone has a mobile phone in the world, so when anything is happening anywhere in the world, we see all this simultaneously. You can send your WhatsApps and everything. So when it comes to art and all these other things, why can't we experience it simultaneously? Why is it that exhibitions are always centered in certain parts of the world, or ideas are always centered in certain parts of the world? Even books, knowledge are always centered in certain parts of the world. You have to be able to have a certain access to get access to a certain material. Why can't we decentralize all these the materials that we produce within the world? And certainly because art is very heavily material based, the question is that as difficult as these materials are, we can decentralize them. After all, even in times of war and all that, where countries are sending weapons across the world which are used for all kinds of things. So why can't we equally invest into building a much better world which actually contains materials that can influence another generation to deviate away from the difficulties of the 20th century and before, which led us to this moment of crisis that we find ourselves living in. So certainly, I think the role, the artists, because sometimes artists say, oh yes, I'm just an artist and mine is to record events or to make the painting. I'm like, no, your role goes a lot beyond that, because art is equal to responsibility. There's a responsibility within the way you produce, the way the thing is disseminated, and also who has access to it eventually or not.
Thank you so much for everything that you do. It's pretty amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. For additional content, please visit cerebralwomen.com and be sure to follow Cerebral Women on Instagram.